Hello, everyone. Happy Thursday. Hope everyone's had a pretty good day so far. It's a nice way to round out the day, coming to Eden's counseling group. We're going to be looking at our monthly webinar today, and it's going to be on calming the chaos, raising emotionally regulated children. I'm Ray. I'm a counselor at Eden's, and you can find more information on me on our website, and I'll also cover it at the end. I primarily work with children ages 6 to 18 plus, so parents, children, other adults. This webinar is going to be recorded and will be posted to YouTube, so you can reference that back whenever you want. And also, for your privacy, we'll have cameras, mics turned off. And please note, if you have any questions that come up, we'll definitely get to those towards the end with our Q&A session, but those can be placed in the chat at that time. During the presentation, I'm going to ask a couple questions that you can just say yes or no to in the chat or give a thumbs up, small little answers like that. And then, at the conclusion of the presentation, we can come together for a little bit more of a discussion. In the chat, you'll see that there is a link to Google Form if you want to grab that link now, or we'll post it again at the end. That is a form that is essentially just for us to hear back from you about how this was today and your feedback on what relevant topics you might want to see in the future. So I gave a little bit of insight into the ages I work with. My previous experience started early on. I've been working with kids for 10 plus years in a variety of capacities as a long-term nanny, working with infancy to adolescence, as a mentor for middle and high school kids. Then as a teacher, I was working with kids 18 months to 6 years. And now, of course, I have a master's in education in counseling. So I'm very grateful to be in my second year of counseling children, adolescents, and their parents, and really look forward to continuing the work and seeing where it takes me. So thank you all for being a part of that tonight. Today, we are going to be learning about emotional regulation, and with that comes dysregulation, which we'll learn about. We'll also learn about modeling behaviors as parents, co-regulation, and then we'll briefly cover some regulation tools and skills. And the good news is that there is so much more out there than what is going to be on this presentation for those skills. So you'll be able to have a little bit of a foundation to build from on your own time. So again, please, just make note of your questions. I don't want you to forget it, and we'll address that towards the end. So basics at first, understanding what emotionally regulated means, and then what the opposite of that would be, which would be dysregulated. So emotional regulation, it can happen automatically without us noticing or intentionally. And it relates to all of our emotions and the way we experience them, as well as how we express those emotions. So to be emotionally regulated is to be in control of your emotions and the effect that they have on your thoughts and behaviors. The opposite of that, to be dysregulated, would be to lack that control of your emotions, the effect they have on your thoughts and behaviors. While these may seem somewhat unfamiliar, these are universal concepts that apply to you, your partner, children, friends, extended family, your coworkers, and even your pets every single day. Not only that, but your emotional regulation changes and shifts as you go about your day, depending on your surroundings, what's going on. So my first question has to do with that. Throughout your day, are there ever times where maybe your child is having an outburst, they're actively ignoring you, things like that? Maybe they won't leave your side. Do you ever feel dysregulation come up for you where your emotions are bubbling up and you're having a hard time controlling thoughts, behaviors? As parents, caretakers, it's fair to assume that it happens somewhat frequently where our kids are pushing our buttons, so to speak. So if we're still trying to figure out a little bit of what it means to be dysregulated, there are actually plenty of physical signs that we can start understanding. And those physical signs are a way of also helping us clue in that something specific is happening in our body, in our mind, in our environment. So some examples are having racing thoughts. Maybe you're sweating, your stomach's hurting, crying, getting choked up, screaming or hitting. Some of these might sound familiar for your kids. Changing in your breath, muscles tensing, your jaws maybe tight, being aware of that. Changes in your sensory, so maybe your skin feels really hot or tingly, there's ringing in your ears, blurry vision, or maybe you're feeling your heart pounding in your chest, something like that. Identifying dysregulation starts within the body, and dysregulation can occur with more positive feelings, such as happiness. Sometimes we might cry from joy, or we may get so excited that our face turns red, we're jumping up and down, our thoughts are racing really fast. It applies to both those positive and negative emotions. Then those initiators feed into the way that we respond. So we have three responses, primarily fight, flight, and freeze. And those are survival responses. So we have fight, which is exactly what it sounds like. We're ready to go, get the energy out, movement, urges to yell, fight, things like that. Then there's flight. So that might be avoiding, running away. That's maybe where we see some lying come in. You want to avoid something. That's a behavior that we might see out of that area. Then there is freeze. So that's paralysis, shut down. Not much is going to get through when you're in that stage. So let's just see a thumbs up or a reaction if you were taught that anger was a bad emotion. Jealousy was a bad emotion. Potentially, yes. Well, we're going to consider that our negative emotions are not equivalent to bad emotions. So we have a large range of emotions that we experience day to day, and we're not able to pick and choose which of those emotions that we want. I know it would be really convenient if we could, but those emotions are there to tell us something. While they may feel uncomfortable or distressing, they're not inherently bad and they don't need to be avoided. They are cues for us to get curious about. With that, all our emotions are valid. So emotions are those cues, and they are triggered by a situation. Maybe a coworker sent you a really passive aggressive email, or environments. Maybe you're around someone who you don't normally feel comfortable with, and that changes the way you perceive your environment. Interactions, behaviors, whether that's a behavior that you do that brings up an emotion or a behavior from someone else. And then even your thoughts can be triggers for your emotions. And it's interesting because it can kind of work both ways. Your emotions can also trigger these thoughts and behaviors. But the emotions are, at the end of the day, cues for us to get curious about, and they can tell us about what we're needing in our physical, psychological, relational, and environmental spaces. With that said, while we acknowledge that emotions are not inherently bad and that our emotions are valid, they come from a valid place, it is important to recognize that some of our responses to those emotions can be unhelpful or harmful. That's also known as maladaptive. And those maladaptive responses don't mean that the emotion behind it is bad or invalid, as we've covered, right? But at the same time, we're not trying to excuse those harmful behaviors. We're not condoning it by recognizing that our emotions are coming from a valid place. We want to address the thoughts and the behaviors themselves and use our emotions to our advantage. So, this is where self awareness comes into play, accountability, impulse control. And it's really important to consider as individuals where we're at developmentally. And then with our kids, children and adolescent brains are still very much in developmental stages. And then even after our brains are fully developed as adults, we're still going to struggle in those areas, right? There are going to be times where we're not always aware of the tone that we use when we respond to our partner. We're not always going to own up to, whatever mistake we made or choice we made. And sometimes we act without thinking. That's just the nature of being a person. So it's important to, consider those components, especially when you're a parent to someone whose brain is not as developed as you are. So the act of practicing self-regulation, I've underlined practice because that is a large portion of it. You take it one step at a time and repeat it over and over again, which admittedly can be frustrating. But just like with working out or something like that, it gets easier over time. So the first general step would be to perceive, to tune in with yourself and notice what you're feeling and pay attention to the urges and actions that you're experiencing. At this stage, you don't have to necessarily know what specific emotion or emotions you're experiencing or why per se, but understanding something is coming up for me, my skin feels hot, I want to yell, and the effect that that may have. Then you pause, take a moment to breathe, a deep breath in, and then a long exhale out. Breathing gives more oxygen to your body, right? And that is something that chemically changes things in your brain and tells you that you are safe. If you think about, historically, or if you're, threatened and you're running from something, your breath is going to change, it's going to speed up, and you're not getting as much oxygen because your brain is going into that survival mode, and the only choice you're making is run, go, do. So with taking deep breaths in and long exhales out, that gives a cue to your brain that I don't need to be in a state of survival right now. If you need, pausing can last for however long. So it could be leaving the room, it could be running an errand to take your mind off it for a second and revisiting it later. You are the one who kind of comes up with those parameters and also the situation. If you're not able to leave, of course, we have to take 1 minute or two and then move forward from there. Once we are at a space where we're a little bit calmer, we're able to then pivot and proceed with mindfulness. So you can revisit the situation and know that your emotions are valid. So it's very possible that they may come up again at some point while you're trying to address that topic. And there's nothing saying that you can't take another break. So that's where you would also be mindful and perceive what's coming up for you again. So this is a lot of you language about you as the parent or general regulation. And you may be wondering, where does my kid come into this? Because that's what I want help with, how my kid behaves. And we've established that, the way that our children act can trigger parents feeling irritated, on edge, angry. And so it's important to consider if you have ever been triggered by your own parent or caregiver. Take a moment to think about that. Maybe there was a time where they yelled at you, or they made a choice that you thought was unfair. Perhaps you reached out to them for help and they responded harshly. Maybe they broke your trust or disappointed you in some way. It's more likely than not that most people have been triggered by their own parent or caregiver. And that's where it's important to recognize the role that family plays and the role that you as a caregiver play with your own child's regulation. So this feeds into modeling and co-regulation. So starting with co-regulation, uh, dysregulation, which we are learning more about, can be really intense at whatever age you are. And when our brains are in that survival, fight, flight, freeze, the parts of our brain that control our emotions and our fears are receiving a lot of input and blood flow. While those areas are activated, the areas that control our rational thinking and our decision making become less active, making it harder to, remember to take a breath or think about, all the factors that play into the situation. Maybe we're really narrow focused in that moment. And for kids, their brains are less developed in the area that relates to decision making and rational thinking, just generally, naturally. So it's important to consider how we as parents can show up for them and provide support in that area that they may need. So co-regulation is the act of having someone who is more regulated provide assistance to someone who is dysregulated, helping to ground them, helping them calm down, and getting them out of that survival response. So we're going to take a look at some social learning theory and how that relates to this idea of modeling. In addition to co-regulating, we can support our kids by modeling, because children take in a lot more information than we anticipate, and they externalize a lot of behaviors that they've observed and just learned from, seeing parents, seeing teachers, even strangers. I'm sure y'all have heard that, children's brains are like sponges, and it's very much true. So this could present as a child yelling at their classmates because they observed yelling at home, or it can manifest as a child choosing to completely adjust something about their personality or a behavior or something they want to avoid a perceived threat, such as judgment, peer pressure, wanting to fit in, things like that. So modeling applies here because in this context, it refers to demonstrating behaviors and consistently practicing them in front of your child to help with their observational learning. The challenging part of this when it comes to regulation is that children are always watching and you are always modeling in some way without even realizing it. And that's where intentionality plays a huge role in helping to keep your kids emotionally regulated. There's also this idea of do as I say and not as I do. And while kids can temporarily, do as they're told, they're very likely to kind of slip up and return to the unwanted behaviors. So helping to reinforce those positive behaviors by modeling themselves, surrounding them with it regularly, can help kids adopt those behaviors and move away from the unwanted ones. And that is where modeling regulation as an adult can benefit a child. So just like learning how to talk, kids learn how to be through observations and experiences as their brains develop. So if we're starting to kind of buy into this idea of my kid is observing their surroundings and my choices, then you might be wondering what you can utilize to keep yourself regulated. We went through general 3 steps that these are some more specific tools that you might be interested in using. And again, there are tons and tons of resources online that you can find what works best for you. A popular one is the stop technique, and it is to stop, pause for a moment, take a breath, observe your thoughts, feelings, and the environment as neutrally as you can. Not trying to pass judgment, just objectively taking a look at the situation, how you're feeling, how things are affecting you. And then proceeding mindfully. So being intentional and choosing the way that you respond. That is a response as opposed to a reaction. Then there is a feeling wheel. That is something that I work with a lot of adults on, because emotional recognition is not something that was taught in school. It's a little bit more popular now, but a lot of the times I'll, pull out a feelings wheel, and I'll have people who just didn't know how many emotions there were, because you can't capture it, right? So having something physical that lists it out and categorizes them can be really helpful to understanding, where you're at. Once you are able to identify a feeling, it can really alleviate distress, confusion, and if you understand your feeling, that means you can also validate that feeling. There are tons of feeling wheels online. So if there is something that captures your interests, I know I've seen some that are inside out themed. I know I've seen some that are also situational emotions, and you can kind of assess what situation you're in, how that might make you feel, move on from there. There are tons of options. So I encourage you to explore online and see. And then playing detective, getting curious, because your emotions matter too. They have a big impact on your day-to-day life. They change throughout the day, and everyone comes into contact with your emotions and their own emotions. So kind of normalizing it on that end. Then there's urge surfing. So just like a wave, our emotions and urges and behaviors have an initial point, an initial trigger. And that point will increase in intensity, and then it'll peak, and then it declines until it's gone. So that peak with parenting may look like screaming at your kid because you feel like that's the only way that they'll listen. It's effective short term, right? But this idea of urge surfing, with that urge of screaming or avoiding, whatever it may be, is a concept that all things we experience, all feelings, urges will pass. And that can be comforting, especially when you're in the moment and it feels really intense and really real. Reminding yourself that it will pass. While we're talking about practicing self-regulation and how showing up, presenting as regulated with your kid can be, impactful for them, it's important to remember self-compassion. So nobody's perfect. Nobody's going to do anything right every single time. And it's important to remember that you are an individual living through each moment for the first time, growing up just like your kiddo. So one moment where you may struggle to stay regulated is not going to define you as a parent. And it actually provides a really amazing opportunity to open up communication with your kid, be honest, let them know what you were feeling, how it affected you, and find a way to repair whatever, negative effect that this regulation might have caused. And that also models honest, open communication with your kids. So if they have something going on, they've already seen that you will come up to them and approach, and they can do the same for you, and practice those emotion identifiers, coping skills together. And then you can just continue practicing. So this is a technique, the 3 R's by Dr. Bruce Perry, that you can use specifically with your child, and it kind of mimics other forms of self-regulation. So this is for co-regulation. I want to highlight initially that using validation from the start can really help to facilitate de-escalation. Um, and then that validation is key throughout all three stages. So if we're starting with regulation, helping to regulate, you help connect with your child, whether that's eye contact, you connect with them physically, maybe they need a hug, or maybe they need to be removed from a room and go into a quiet space. Whatever it is, use your position as a parent to help ground them and coach them into that calmer state. We're going to get to kind of some coping skills and exercises in a second that we could, guide them through. Then we relate. So express empathy and understanding. And at that point, you've already validated your child's feelings. I see that you're really frustrated. I understand you don't want to get off the tablet. Letting them know they're seen, and that can really help them feel understood and like you can relate to them. Then there is reason. So once your child is calm, you can revisit the event. And this is the most effective when your child is calmer and their brain doesn't feel like it's on fire, right? So work with your child to plan for future situations, maybe review coping skills, and reflect on what they were feeling in the moment and how we can make choices differently next time. Here are those examples of some regulation activities. And as I've said, there are tons and tons of resources online. These are just a couple that I know that my clients really like working with. So first one here, 5-finger breathing. That one's great because you just need your hand for it and you always have that with you. You put your hand out in front of you and you take your pointer finger on the opposite hand, start at the base of your thumb and inhale as you move your finger up to the tip of your thumb, and then exhale as you run it down to the base of your thumb. Then you repeat that up and down sliding process as you're breathing on all of your fingers, and do it as many times as you need. 2 to 3 times on average tends to help. So you could introduce that to your kid, and in the moment when they are dysregulated, remind them, hey, remember that 5-finger breathing we did? Let's try to do it together. Then there is stuffy breathing. This is something that's especially popular with younger kiddos. That's where you get them to lay down on their back, chest facing up, and they can take their favorite stuffy and place it on their chest. And as they breathe, watch the stuffy rise up and down. And the trick here is that in order for the stuffy to be comfortable or stay balanced, whatever it may be, you have to breathe slowly and intentionally and get control of that breath. Then we have 5 senses. So this has to do with grounding through the senses, as it implies. So you count backwards from 5, starting with 5 things that you can see, and you can categorize them by 5 things that are red, or 5 people wearing a hat, or just 5 random things that you see. And initiate that awareness of your surroundings, taking yourself outside of your head and the dysregulation and more into the current present. Then there's 4 things you can feel. That may be the chair underneath you, the shoes on your feet. Maybe it's the cold air entering your nose and into your lungs. 3 things you can hear: air conditioner, cars honking, dog barking. 2 things you can smell. This is where I find it gets a little harder, but you can do however many of these you need. You don't have to do all categories. And then 1 thing you can taste. Then for people who like visualizing, you can do leaf on the stream, which is where you acknowledge your emotion or your thought and you visualize it to be a small leaf. And you don't feel negatively towards this leaf. You feel as neutral as you can, and you acknowledge it and prepare yourself to let go of it. So releasing that leaf, you place it on a stream and you watch it get carried away further and further into the distance. And then you can practice taking a breath. And if the thought comes back up, of course, you can repeat that process until you're feeling calmer. So we have creating space from dysregulation and some more regulation examples. So some things that people really like for co-regulation is physical connection or hugs. And sometimes people are the opposite. They might really want some alone time. And either one of those is okay as long as we're getting to a place of regulation. Then there is more sensory based, holding an ice cube, watching it melt, having an ice pack on your chest, drinking cold water or splashing water on your face. That's one that I think can be handy if you're out and about, you're at a restaurant, you're at school, excuse yourself to go to the bathroom, splash water in your face, start to calm down. So that's something that kids are able to access on their own too. Movement, shaking, jumping around, hitting or kicking. The important part here is, of course, to identify appropriate targets like mattresses or punching bags, screaming into pillows, spending time outside. And this is a potentially controversial one, but limiting screen time. So some people may choose to watch something as a way to disconnect and relax, and it might work totally well for them. And other times, limiting screen time can, or engaging in screen time can be overstimulating. It could add to all of the chaos and then maybe even be harder to separate from that screen to then revisit the topic, repair. So depending on your child, limiting that screen time might be the right choice for y'all. Then we have a calm down corner, which if this is something you're able to provide, phenomenal. If not, there are tons of other options. But one thing that I like to suggest for parents to consider is that if they do have a calm down corner, to consider having it in a neutral part of the house. That way that the parent themselves can model using it. A lot of the times kids will get calm down quarters, they never go in it, they don't initiate it themselves, or it turns kind of into a punishment and it doesn't end up achieving what we want it to achieve. So having it in a neutral part, or asking your kid if it's in their room, hey, can I go use your calm down corner, and model that behavior that we want to see in them, it oftentimes can help kids feel more comfortable initiating that themselves. And if they need help at first, co-regulating in that corner, that's another moment there where you're not only modeling, but you're also helping with co-regulation. So in that corner, you might have bubbles to blow. That brings in the breath work, fidgets to fidget with, books to read or flip through. Maybe some of those are emotion-based books, glitter jars to watch or shake around, a screen-free music player, CD player, smart home speaker. There are tons of different options for that. A visual nightlight that can be really soothing for some kids. Pillows and blankets to snuggle with, a weighted stuffed animal, and then something like a feelings wheel or chart to help your kid identify emotions. And again, that's where that co-regulation or modeling can come into play, showing them how to use that feelings chart at home, help them identify and understand what they're feeling, why they're feeling it. So some of the takeaways we have is number one on the side here, which I know can be really hard, is to practice self-care. But our regulation is definitely influenced by if we're having quality sleep or if we're eating properly. So considering that. And then the best time to introduce regulation skills is outside of those emotionally charged moments. So when people are dysregulated, trying to introduce it then isn't going to be the most effective. Their brains are not prepared to take in that new information. But calming the chaos at home has a lot of different factors. And one of those is how individuals in the home respond to stimuli and triggers. So raising children to be emotionally regulated starts at home, where they can observe regulation skills, start using them themselves, mimic what they see and implement those techniques with guidance and then eventually on their own. So it's important here that we remember that your child is learning just like you are, and that developmentally it is appropriate for them to have some struggle with that self regulation. And then, of course, to give yourself compassion because being a parent has so many you can't even count how many factors, how many things you're balancing all at once. And you got to be kind to yourself if you're going to be regulated, because it's really easy to slip into self-blame and shame and doubting in yourself. So being sure to practice that self-compassion. A couple resources to consider. Again, tons available online, but these are some that I've appreciated. A kid's book about nervous system regulation. That is a picturesque book that you can use to start the conversation of nervous system regulation with your kiddo. Then Raising Kids with Big Baffling Behaviors. That's a good one by Robin Gobble. And she also has a website with free resources that touch on co-regulation, physical regulation, how to not flip your lid when you're trying to work with your kid, things like that. So I'd recommend checking her resources out. The Whole Brain Child, that gives some good insight into children and their developing mind, the stages that they're at, and how we can work with them and meet them where they are. And then this is a video that I just think is interesting to watch. So I don't know if you can take a picture of the link or just look up the general study on your own time, but it essentially is a study where they have an infant in a room and they have some they're playing with, and then an emoter comes in and expresses negatively towards what is happening in the space. And then you watch after the emoter leaves just how much the child's behavior changes, and they choose to prioritize the social cues instead of playing. They kind of shut down and don't engage the same way that they were because they're fearful of retaliation or whatnot. We are at the question phase. So do we have any questions from anyone? I'm giving it a moment in case people are typing. Do you find that some kids outgrow their outburst at a certain age without interventions? Yes and no. It depends. So there are a couple of factors that play into it. Like I was talking about, home factors, what's going on at home can have an influence on general dysregulation within a kid. Um, Also, neurodivergence can play an impact. Kids with ADHD can definitely have a harder time with regulating their emotions. Maybe they're more sensitive, things like that. But it is developmentally natural for kids to have outbursts, which means that as they develop, there will be some outgrowing of those behaviors. It just really depends on the kid and the circumstances as well. Of course. That's a great question. Anyone else? How can we effectively implement these concepts with children under special education? So when you say special education, I'm envisioning like a classroom environment. Yes. So that is an area, emotional regulation in the home to me is a very different thing from emotional regulation in the classroom. Um, and at home is where the work that I do with people is the foundation, right? That's where we learn the skills, that's where we practice them the most. Um, then when we're out in the real world, we do not have control over, uh, it applies to adulthood, our bosses or our teachers, right? So the hope is that teachers will have understanding of where children are at developmentally, and will also have an understanding of where specific children are at with their different needs or things like that. So that's where we can facilitate open conversation with our schools. Uh, if you're working with a counselor here, we can find a way of connecting with the schools. If we sign an ROI, we can let people know what we're observing here. But you can also do that absolutely without a counselor, where you advocate for your kid, talk to your teachers, talk to the school. It really is about education and resources for teachers, and also teachers regulation, right? Teachers have to be regulated to help their students feel safe and regulated, and that's a tricky one because it is a chaotic job, just like with being a parent. We want to be regulated all the time, but we can't always do that. Does that answer? Yeah, it's a multifaceted, very situational um, topic. We've got time for more if anyone has anything. Give it another minute or so. The question actually, if anyone's typing, I'll address this in terms of regulation at school and if our teachers are regulated and things like that. If we have a child who's living in two different households, what is practiced in each household also has a big impact on what our child is able to do. So if it's the same thing with like sticking to a regimented schedule. If one parent has a bedtime, the other doesn't, and then it kind of throws off sleep cycle, things like that. It's the same where if one parent is practicing these regulation skills and the others doesn't, the kid does absorb those things, and it can make it a little bit harder to maintain regulation. Also, adverse childhood experiences or trauma that can have an effect on children's ability to work on that regulation, but it's not impossible. It just takes a little bit more time. All right. Well, if anyone has anything else, just throw it into chat. I'm going to move forward. So there's me. And yeah, I've really appreciated having this time and talking about this topic that I'm really passionate about and work on with clients every day. I work with children ages 6 to 18 and older, adults, parents, and we work on topics such as anxiety and depression, LGBTQIA plus topics, parenting, self-esteem, ADHD, neurodivergence, and more. So it really depends on kind of who comes in, what they're looking for, and how we can work together. Along with using a person-centered and child-centered play therapy approach, I do incorporate CBT and DBT skills into work with clients. So we do a lot of emotional identification and kind of searching for causes, understanding cause and effect in that regard, and then also learning skills from different methodologies and how they might apply to our life. And I really appreciate you guys' time. I've been working with kids and adolescents and parents for a very long time. So it's really wonderful being at this stage where I'm, still at the very beginning of this career, and very grateful that I get to support and still facilitate growth in myself and in others. So thank you guys for joining me with that. Slide. Okay, yes. So for more information, you can call Edens to set up a free 15-minute consultation, and that would be with myself. I am taking new clients currently, and I'm sure there are, we have other wonderful child therapists here and other couples, family therapists. We have basically, we cover a lot of bases here. So please, reach out over call or text and see what services we can provide. Again, we do have a feedback form. It just popped up in the chat. So go ahead and grab that if you can, fill it out and let us know your feedback and what you're looking for in the future.